Hello everyone, welcome to CultureTalk, where we share insights and learnings from leaders in arts and culture. Today we're exploring a shift that's been quietly reshaping the cultural sector for years, the move from one-off capital investments towards subscription-based platforms, and what that means for how venues operate, fund their technology, and develop their teams. To help us navigate this, I'm joined by Ben Park, a culture and entertainment sector expert with over 20 years of experience. Ben spent 12 years at Spektrix, joining when it was a small startup and helped grow the company to what it is today. Before his time at Spektrix, Ben worked venue side at The Place, a contemporary dance theatre, so he's experienced this landscape from multiple perspectives. He now runs his own consultancy, helping cultural organisations and technology suppliers unlock growth. So hi Ben. Before we dive into today's conversations, I'd love to hear a bit about your journey and what led you to spend 2 decades working at the intersection of technology and culture.
You make it sound like it was planned, but yes, thank you. And thanks for having me. So as you mentioned, I worked at The Place, but prior to that, I spent earlier part of my career working in festivals. So I started off at the Edinburgh Fringe. Like lots of people, moved to an arts centre called the Courtyard in Hereford. And then latterly The Place. I went to a drama school. I studied theatre management. I just kind of always wanted to be in that world, even when I was growing up. My parents are both professional musicians, and it just felt like a place that I wanted to be. So that path was quite linear, but then the technology bit was a bit more of a curveball. When I was at The Place, I found myself responsible for lots of different systems. It just kind of landed on my desk rather than something that I'd deliberately chosen. And I began to become interested in how they work, and what wasn't working well for the organisation. And for the older listeners in the audience, they'll be familiar with a system that's called Databox. And that was one of the early box office systems that really enabled people to buy tickets online. And I spent a lot of my life coaxing it, making it work, massaging it, and trying to keep it running at weekends. And that just kind of piqued my interest. And really it followed on from there. So I then spoke to Spektrix when they were just entering the market, eventually bought Spektrix when I was at The Place, and then spoke to that company a lot because they were very small at the time. They took lots of feedback from me, and I had a really close relationship with the team, and then eventually went to work with them. And that really just sort of cemented my interest in where technology and the arts kind of intersect. So it wasn't by design, but I ended up going that way, and here we are a long time later.
Yeah. And you joined Spektrix when it was still a startup and kind of challenging the established players. What was it about that moment that made the sector ready for change? And what can we learn from that period as venues now grapple with new technologies like AI?
Spektrix benefited hugely from having first mover advantage, really. So that was really, we're capitalizing on a new way of delivering technology to the sector. And there were other very well established providers in the market. At that time, they weren't delivering cloud products in the way that they now are. And at that time, I'm talking around the 2010s here, cloud for this sector and others was just a totally different way of thinking about using software. And in venues, it just wasn't really a term that was understood or thought about at all, both in terms of the functionality, the delivery model, but also the business model that goes along with that. When I initially spoke to customers of Spektrix, those who were quite forward-looking or interested in technology, they could see that this was the way things were going and decided to make the leap early, whereas others really wanted to see quite a bit more maturity before they took that risk and changed from what they were familiar with and comfortable with. Now, if we fast forward and look at emerging technologies and specifically thinking about AI, I think we're in a slightly different place. There is a change coming, but at the moment it's not fully clear how the key vendors in the market are going to harness AI to improve their offering. I think that will come in time, but we're not done investigating the use cases for it yet. I also think we're all probably familiar with using our own pieces of technology in our day-to-day lives where AI has been kind of stuffed into it, not necessarily always with a good purpose or reason. I'm quite glad to see that actually the key technology providers in this sector have resisted the temptation to do that, and we're waiting to see what happens a bit and see where the real benefit can lie. I think there is it's really interesting though, and I think there is benefit that can be brought to the sector, and there are some really nice emerging tools. There's a new tool called Caro by Spektrix, which is a very interesting customer service tool that goes way beyond what you might think a chatbot to be or traditional chatbot, and really harnesses AI to provide a really great customer experience for venues. And I think, oh, that's a really interesting use case. And if we see more in that direction, which is putting the audience at the center of what AI can bring, great. That's an interesting thing to explore, I think.
You mentioned risk earlier there, and that's been a bit of a recurring motif in some of the conversations I've been having recently about the appetite for risk within the sector. Do you feel those who were perhaps more willing to take that leap in those early Spektrix days kind of got a bit of an advantage because they got those advantages of Spektrix and cloud-based systems a bit earlier on?
I mean, hindsight is 2020, right? I think if you were a customer of Spektrix at the time, there was definitely a leap of faith involved sometimes because we were not proven and we didn't have years and years of evidence to say that it was all going to be absolutely plain sailing. But Spektrix did a very good job at working hard for those early customers to mitigate any of that sense of risk. But yeah, there was a bit of a jumping off point for some organizations who felt really uncomfortable with the idea of putting their box office system in somebody else's server rather than their cupboard somewhere behind box office. But there are trade-offs between both of those things. And generally speaking, I think those earlier customers, yeah, they had a good experience.
Perhaps we can unpack some of those fears because there are a lot of kind of different fears based on kind of subscription-based platforms. But it's interesting now because subscription-based platforms are now pretty standard within the sector especially for ticketing systems, CRMs, emails. Perhaps websites have been a bit slower to follow. You've had a front row seat to this shift. What is driving the move towards SaaS in the sector, and why do you think websites have lagged behind in that sense?
I think there are a couple of reasons for that drive it. I think ticketing systems, email tools, they can broadly be considered as operational utilities, and many organizations need them, and they need similar underlying core functionality. The foundational requirements are broadly the same. There are nuances to that, of course, but there is a broad enough utility for the developers of those platforms to create a standardized product and effectively rent it out to their users. And continuing to develop those products over time, I think that's when you tend to see the providers layer more industry-specific tools or things that get them into more niche parts of the sector to support the nuance of the sort of various different needs of the arts and cultural world. I personally think websites are a little bit of a different beast. They serve many purposes, and one of which is they are an expression of an organization's identity online. And they're also often the entry point to an organization for a wide range of activities that go way beyond what you would buy a ticket for or things that involve a transaction. And the website has to kind of be all things to all people. And they're often integrated with other ticketing systems and now increasingly a wider range of digital tools that we have come to describe in the sector as the ecosystem. And whilst the foundations of websites might be common, I think there's often customization that sits on top of that, that compared to CRM systems. And I wonder sometimes if that's why it has taken a bit more time for the sector to adapt or require that of vendors that they are looking at a more subscription-based model. I think we're just still in the world, as you say, where we're used to buying websites as big upfront capital costs most of the time. I also think there's just a couple of other key reasons. Subsidized cultural sector is where many of the agencies in this space get most of their business from. And subsidized organizations that rely on public funding are often awarded that funding in cycles that are between 1, 2 or 3 years, or by applying for specific capital grants to support purchases or investment in digital. And agencies have had to build their businesses in a way that allows them to offer services on that basis, so they are aligned to that kind of CapEx model themselves, and venues are used to it. So until we need a bit more of a sea change, a bit more of a critical mass before we'll see the same change with website vendors compared to those in the sort of ticketing and CRM world.
There's a lot to unpack there. I'd maybe take the customizations one first, because I think that's one that's come up a fair bit in terms of organizations thinking they need a custom build, especially it has kind of been so traditional and kind of known in the sector, and that's kind of why the sector has leaned that way previously. But when you dig into it, most of what venues are asking for often already exist on sector-specific platforms. I think this is why sector-specific platforms are becoming more and more commonplace within the sector, knowing that we know exactly, everyone needs a seat plan or integrating ticketing systems. I wonder how much of the resistance to SaaS is actually a discovery problem, i.e. venues not knowing what's already out there, i.e. SaaS platforms that already deliver all the very specific needs that venues need for their website, when they previously think, oh, actually, I need something custom built for that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a challenge around that. But look, I think if you're in the technology space of the culture and art sector, and I count myself in that category, we spend a hell of a lot of time thinking about this stuff. If you're running an arts organization, you just don't. You get on with what you actually need to do, which is keeping that organization operating and delivering against your purpose. So I think as technology vendors, we've got a responsibility to help people discover that stuff and understand what is available off the shelf. And there's lots of ways that we all do that, but clearly, I think there's more work to be done, because often, as you rightly point out, arts organisations are not necessarily familiar with what's available in the market. I think there are some, and we're talking about really small numbers here, of organisations who perhaps might need a custom solution if they're doing something that really isn't serviced by an existing platform. And I think the assumption that's easy to make there is that that's about size or scale, but I actually really think it's about business model and the product or audience that organisation is serving rather than size. And also, we have to just think about what's an appropriate investment. The majority of organisations, I think, could do well by looking at the kind of cost-benefit argument of using an off-the-shelf product that's best serviced by a software as a service provider. Is it still in 2026 an appropriate investment for a cultural organisation to be building their own software stack effectively and then managing that in-house? I think it's best to defer to those with expertise in that area to take that burden off the organisation.
Yeah, I mean, often control is often a word that's used when organizations talk about being a bit fearful of SaaS platforms, thinking that they're no longer going to have control of their website or their ticketing platform or whatever that may be. And you mentioned, there's a kind of value proposition there, and that some organizations where it might suit them going down the bespoke route. Maybe we could drill into that in terms of what has the sector gained from embracing cloud-based solutions over the past decade, and in what situations does a bespoke, heavily customized approach work for a particular organization?
I'm not going to rule out and say that there's a hard and fast position in saying that an arts cultural organisation should never use a bespoke platform. In my experience, I'm yet to encounter an organisation where their needs couldn't be broadly met by an existing provider with a combination of different tools and having really good detailed conversations with a vendor about what their requirements are. And if we look at the benefits that the sector has gained by using that software as a service model, it really is the same benefits that have been applied to lots of other sectors that have benefited from that technology, i.e. you have a tech provider, tech providers in this context, who can develop a centralized platform that has broad utility for the largest part of the sector. And they're able to develop product features, respond to the changing needs of the sector, meet customer expectations in a way that benefits all of the people that use that platform. It is really not possible to achieve the same economy of scale that benefits users, provides a good product, and keeps the cost down without doing that on a software as a service model. So fundamentally, that is the main benefit, I'd say.
Yeah, yeah. I'd like to come on to vendor responsibility and community building a bit, because you previously made the point that if vendors are asking organizations to commit to long-term subscriptions, there's a responsibility that comes with that, i.e. to invest in their users rather than just to sell to them. You pointed to Testura as an example of an organization that's really led with community. What does effective vendor-led community building look like to you?
I think it really, so community can mean customer retention sometimes for vendors, and that to me is not community, but it can also mean creating a proactive two-way dialogue between customer and software maker, and then also between the different customers of those platforms. And it will often go beyond the simple use case of what the software is for. And look, that obviously works for a vendor because it means that people build networks within that community and within fellow users of those products. Those people move jobs. They have an asset of understanding that ecosystem. They take that system with them to their new venue. Of course, that has a benefit. But actually, for the sector, what it's able to do is make sure that the vendor understands the needs, the evolving needs. They do change considerably over time, that should be met by software, and it helps to keep them accountable. I think it helps to have many voices directed towards one vendor relationship that enables users to feel that their needs are heard and represented in a way that I think otherwise, if you're stuck in a sort of one-to-one support relationship, is quite difficult to achieve.
Yeah. And for the venues who feel like they're not being heard by their technology provider, how can they redefine this relationship? How can they push for more input or direction on the platforms they rely on?
So I think this is very easy for me to say because I'm not working in an arts or cultural organisation at the moment, and I'm outside of those organisations looking in, but I have been there. I think there is a bit of responsibility on both sides. So generally speaking, all of the platforms that are available on the market are very capable, high quality tools and do a lot, have a huge amount of functionality. I think on the venue side, there is a requirement to think, are we actually making use of this tool? Have we got the skills in-house necessary to leverage it in a way that delivers what we need? And if you can answer that question confidently, I think, but the vendor relationship is not working, it's absolutely within your gift to hold that vendor to account. And it means having those difficult conversations. And ultimately, it means voting with your feet and going somewhere else. Now, one of the benefits of that software as a service model is that typically there isn't a big upfront cost or onboarding cost to move platforms. And therefore, there is obviously some pain in replatforming, but it is often not a financial penalty. And if it isn't working for you, I think you should move. I don't think you should feel trapped and that you have to stay. There are some very good other options now in the market, which since Spektrix started doing that a long time ago, software as a service is the norm. And yeah, there are lots of other options on the table.
Software platforms are ultimately a tool as well, is something I always try to remind people. And I always wonder, how much responsibility should vendors be taking to develop those broader skills within the sector, especially when skills development and talent retention is often talked about as a problem within the sector at the moment. Platforms are often coming to venues saying, we've got this great tool, but then shouldn't they also be like developing those skills to make the most of those platforms as well?
So I think I just perhaps zoom out slightly further to broaden your question slightly. I think the use of the platforms is representative of a need to develop broader digital skills in the sector beyond just how you use one software platform or another. I know from experience of recruiting in the sector that when you are looking for roles which are really focused around digital and really have revenue targets against them, or are really looking at growth, those are not metrics that people in this sector generally in digital roles are measured against. And if we look outside of our sector, that is much more common. So I think vendors, yes, there is a responsibility in helping them to equip their users with the skills that they need to make the product work well for them. I think they also need to develop products in a way which means that they're easy to use. But on the flip side of that, I think as a sector, we have a collective responsibility to invest in the skills necessary to really make sure that we're taking advantage of digital in all the ways that it can benefit us. And ultimately, for me, that's about connecting with audiences and helping to further the mission of arts and culture.
You mentioned there that a lot of roles, especially marketing roles within the sector, rarely kind of position the roles as being about growth and revenue. They often focus more on promoting what's on rather than growing the business. Why do you think that is? And do you think it needs to change?
I think that using the expression arts and cultural organisations, we're talking about a really wide spectrum of different types of organisations here. But first and foremost, their mission is not about generating income. It's about delivering against their artistic goals and artistic ambition, which is often delivering community benefit, exposing people to creativity, supporting people in lots of aspects of life. That has to be the first and foremost priority for those organisations, and I believe it should be. Is it incompatible with running a good business? I don't think so. I think you can do both at the same time, but I don't think that's universally held opinion or universally understood in the sector. And you've got to balance the books. We're not in a world where funding and ticket sales alone cover your costs. Organisations have to do a lot more than that to survive. And yeah, to answer your question, consider how organisations might get started with that. Particularly organisations in particular, I really think it's about walking in your audience's shoes, walking in your customer's shoes, and really think about the simple stuff like how they're planning to spend their time with you. So if they're coming to a traditional evening performance, for example, really thinking, what else are they going to be doing around that? How can we capture a bit more of that spend? Are they going to be going to a restaurant? Are they going to be packaging some other experience around it so they have a complete night out? How can we bring more of that into our organisation? I don't think that dilutes or detracts from an artistic mission. I think it's simply around capturing more of that income so that you provide a really great audience experience in addition to what's on stage or the real reason that someone is with you, and that also supports the work of the organisation.
You mentioned the kind of artistic mission being a priority for a lot of venues, and it's difficult to generalize here because, as you say, there is such a wide variety of organisations. But I feel that maybe that artistic mission might be more relevant to the non-profits, where they have a bit more backing from the Arts Council or local funders. But for the ones who aren't a non-profit, and actually we had a really great example at the SALT revenue generation conference late last year from Marlow Theatre as a case study, where they were very kind of commercial in the way they thought about their strategy. I wonder whether that kind of artistic mission might, well, as we heard, as you said, the funding issue is prevailing in the sector, and I wonder whether the artistic mission is kind of hindering that progress within the sector of being a bit more commercial, trying to be a bit more independent with their own revenue in order to support themselves and in turn support the sector.
Look, there are some organisations that already do a really, really amazing job at this. The Marlow is definitely one of them. I think operates in a commercial way, but is a non-profit, and it really proudly wears that badge. And I think that's a really great example that lots of organisations can learn from. Does one hinder the other? Possibly, but what is the point of the sector existing in the first place if it isn't to deliver some kind of public benefit and public good? And so I think that, for me, that equation has to remain the same, whatever the circumstances, that you have to be able to deliver on your mission before you consider anything else. But a close second, really closely following up behind that, is how can you balance the books? How as an organisation can you become sustainable without relying on public subsidy, which is heading in the wrong direction ultimately, both in the UK and beyond? That is an urgent and important question, and I think a huge number of people in the sector are working diligently every day to try and answer it, but there's more we can do. And that's why I think where there is perhaps a sometimes slight turning up of the nose at being more commercial, we have to get over that. I think it's really possible to do great work, really deliver against the mission of an organization, whilst also running an effective business.
I think there's, based on some of the conversations I've had, there is real appetite amongst certain individuals and organizations to develop those commercial and digital skills in-house. But ultimately, it's down to those organizations they work for to provide that training. When budgets are tight, how can venues encourage skills development within their teams?
So I think going back to your question about vendors and what responsibility they have, a lot of the vendors in the market have actually got really great, fantastic skills development schemes and training available. I think sometimes they're underused. So I think that's a really great place to start, because you're already paying for that effectively. And if you've got people in your organization that could benefit from that, then you should ask for it. The vendors, whilst they will proudly tell you about it whilst you're in the market for buying their system, sometimes they're less forthcoming with it once you're a customer, because it has an overhead for them and a cost. But you really should go and talk to them about it and take advantage of it. I also think there are lots of skills workshops available within the sector for free for funded organizations that individuals should take advantage of. And I'd also suggest that wherever possible, we're looking for skills programs outside of the sector that are free or very low cost that individuals can take advantage of. If you look at, for example, the emergence of AI tools, the majority of the major providers in that space are providing really extensive, high quality academy type services that enable you to understand and take advantage of AI. Clearly, they're geared towards their own commercial interests, but actually there's a huge amount you can learn from that, and it's totally cost-free. So I don't think you should spend nothing on it. I think it's important to budget for it, even when budgets are tight. Investing in your people is critical, but where that's not possible or practical, I think, take advantage of as much of that very low cost or free stuff as you can.
Yeah. I've also heard from venue staff struggle to connect with peers at neighboring organizations, and they want to connect with them to kind of share ideas or talk through challenges. Is there still a mindset of seeing each other as competitors within the sector, and how can we encourage more peer-to-peer learning?
Well, look, sometimes you are competitors. If you're in a small city or town and there's one or two venues and you're not working with each other, then you are often going after each other's audiences. You have a shared audience. But I don't think that means that you can't collaborate. And I certainly think it's not competition in the way that we're talking about big business and really trying to harm one business by taking your customers to yours. I think it is really important to pick up the phone and speak to those people and build the relationships and understand what it is to mean competition in that context, and also to define what you know and you can share, and the knowledge that you can share about your locality or your local audiences. I think not doing that, you're cutting a nose off to spite your face. But it does happen. For years I would visit venues whilst I was working at Spektrix. And the staff in those organisations would go to national conferences and events, but they would not speak to the venue down the road, and they would hazard a guess about what they were doing or what their own challenges are. And I think that's a pity. If you've got people down the road who are effectively fighting the same fight as you, why not build a relationship with them and talk to them? There's a huge amount you can learn from doing that. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, I'd like to move on to a topic that comes up all the time in our sector. It's time to talk about money. The cultural sector, particularly in the UK and Europe, is largely funded through capital investments, as you mentioned earlier, those one-off grants from trusts, local governments, the Arts Council. And the model aligned neatly with one-off projects, especially building restorations. It aligns very easily with that, but it often creates friction with subscription platforms. Is the way we fund cultural organisations actually holding back digital progress, do you think?
I think it goes beyond digital progress. I think the funding model is the rhythm that drives many decisions in cultural organisations, not least the artistic decisions, programming, big projects like grassroots investment, building, literal buildings, construction work. It affects everything. Everything in those organizations is dictated by that. And yeah, that also affects digital. I think, does it hold things back? Yes, to an extent. It can delay progress, and it forces organizations to defer projects that would otherwise benefit them and their audiences. However, the funding environment, I'm speaking specifically here about the UK, public funding, it is tied to multi-year cycles that are ultimately driven by government investment. I don't think that model's likely to shift in the near future. It may shrink, but the model isn't likely to change. So I think we have to work with that rather than against it. When we come back to the concept of subscription models in the sector, yeah, clearly that has worked for many organizations because that model has been widely adopted by lots of different types of technology provider. But when an organization really is hamstrung by a funding decision or a funding model, I think vendors should and can show flexibility to accommodate that in order to support their customers.
Is that not kind of the wrong way around of thinking about things, though? If vendors are, clearly there's a product that works well for an organization, but that supplier, either rightly or wrongly, is having to kind of switch their pricing model or the way they invoice an organization just to fit the funding model, just because it's embedded into our sector. To me, that seems a bit kind of a kind of blocker and a barrier within the sector, and perhaps is stopping progress in other areas.
Well, I'm sure if you're a vendor, you don't necessarily want to do that. It's not your first choice. You want to bill monthly or annually and keep doing that over time. And if you look at the way that software as a service companies are valued and understood in their own economic models, it really is about all of that recurring revenue model. But also, if you're running a big business that is working for a small sector, you have to accept that there's a degree of variation to the types of organizations that are within it and their own financial resilience. Ultimately, I think that comes down to a question of, do you want that customer or not? And if you do, then yeah, you need to show a little bit of flexibility. I don't think every vendor could do that for every customer, because then it does undermine the model of being able to continually invest in their platforms and release updates for all users. So I've seen lots of evidence that many organizations can follow that model, but where there is a limited number of exceptions where you can't, I think demonstrating some flexibility goes a long way.
I guess developing that a bit further, there's often this kind of tension within budgets between CapEx, capital investment, and OpEx. And technology platforms, because perhaps with their subscription base, I've always seen as more OpEx, but organizations are perhaps kind of billing them under their CapEx kind of column in their budget. Perhaps is that creating some tension for organizations, and what needs to change for that shift to happen?
I think yes, possibly is the answer to your question. I think, look, considering a technology purchase as a CapEx expenditure, there are, if you're buying a lighting rig for your theatre, is that a CapEx investment? Yes, I think it probably is. You don't have to reinvest in it all the time. It will last, it's durable, it will last for a long time. There'll be some maintenance costs, but you'll probably be able to keep it in your venue for 10, 15, maybe even longer number of years. But for technology, a software stack, actually, I think if you only budget for it now as a capital expenditure model, you are holding yourself back. And if you can move towards that model of regular payments rather than having to be tied to your funding decision or other kind of major budget fixture every 3 to 4 years, it's a much better way of doing things, not least because often it enables you to tie the cost of the product that you're using to the amount of money that your organization brings in. So you are scaling the amount of money that you're spending in relation to your revenue. With a CapEx model, you're never doing that. The amount that you spend is always fixed, regardless of how many tickets you sell or how many programs you're selling to people. Whereas that OpEx model is much more aligned, it's much more responsive to what's ringing through the tills effectively.
Yeah. I mean, that's just the funding aspect is only kind of one aspect of the relationship organizations have with kind of technology platforms and their vendors. And you've kind of worked in that space for a long time. And there's often been talk about the sector being a bit more kind of technically literate. In your experience, what is the kind of mindset shift the sector needs to make in order to either utilize technology more effectively or to have more effective relationships with the technology partners?
I think ticketing system, I'm speaking specifically about ticketing systems here, but I think the same applies to other tools as well. So website platforms or other kind of secondary spend tools. Those tools have evolved from being utilities that you need. So you need to be able to sell a ticket, effectively, right? You need, one way or another, you've got to be able to do that. We used to do it on paper, then it moved to a database, and now it's moved to this full e-commerce world that we operate in. And that was the purpose that they fulfilled. Now, those tools have evolved dramatically, and also so have consumer or audience expectations of the way that they interact with and the service that they receive from the organizations that they spend their money with. So I think in addition to the investment in digital skills for the people within those organizations, there is also really an interesting model where you should be holding those vendors to account. So if you're spending, let's say, 1 to 3% of your turnover on your ticketing system or your website platform, I would really be looking to get that back, perhaps 2 or 4 times over in terms of the revenue that those systems are really helping me to generate. So I'm talking about tools that encourage audiences to come more frequently, to spend a bit more money, or to extend their relationship with the organization in a way which provides mutual benefit and often the exchange of cash. If the vendor that you're working with is not helping you to do with that, then you either need to hold them to account or vote with your feet and go somewhere else. So that, I think, is the way to have an effective relationship between the vendor and the organization, is really to think, we're spending a lot of money on this thing. Is it giving us more than that money back? And if not, why not?
Yeah, and you mentioned risk earlier as well, and I think that's something a lot of organizations are fearful of when they're looking for a new vendor or looking to swap vendors. And I have the same thing, looking at MarTech platforms. I always feel like I never really know whether it's going to be successful until, I paid for it and I'm using it daily for at least 3 months. What can organizations do to make more informed decisions about what platforms to go with, and to kind of mitigate some of that risk?
So I think you need to be really honest when you're in the market and you're looking for a new product. You need to be really honest with the vendors that you're speaking to about why you're doing that. Are you looking to solve a specific problem? Is your current provider relationship not working? Do you think that the needs of your organization have shifted and what you've got at the moment doesn't work? Providing a vendor with a super long procurement document is not the way to initiate that dialogue. You need to have a conversation with those people. The people who work inside vendor organizations really understand the sector, and they really understand the people that use their products, and they're often able to give really, really good advice way before you're getting into a sales conversation about whether or not their platform or another platform might be an appropriate one to use. So that's a really good way to start eliminating some of that risk straight away. You've got to be clear about what your reasons are for being in the market. Secondly, I think you absolutely should be asking to speak to customers of the platforms that you're considering working with. And I know, as a vendor, I've done this many times myself, you'll offer to reference clients, and the clients that you offer to introduce them to, they're going to give you a good reference and they're going to give you a good write-up. But actually, if you want to really test that, find people who are using those products and speak to them without going via the vendor, and really ask them what it's like, what is their experience day to day. And if the vendor's worth their salt, you'll hear some good and some bad experiences. Not every relationship is absolutely perfect, and then on balance you can make a more informed decision. So yeah, I think those are the sort of core ways of mitigating the risk. If your circumstances are very specific, and you've got a use case for a platform which feels really outside of the norm or really specific to the needs of your business model, ask the vendor to model and demonstrate to you how they're going to do it. Let them provide you with a solution that means you can play around with it, you can test it before you sign any documents or do any kind of purchase. Actually really get them to prove that they can meet their solution meets your needs. And if you do that, yeah, you generally speaking are going to come across the pitfalls that you otherwise might not encounter until after you've done the deal.
Yeah, I find word of mouth and kind of referrals from other peers is still a really powerful resource for the sector.
Yeah, and that's another reason why, if you've got another venue down the road, can you ring them up and ask them what they considered at the time they were last in the market, or what their experience of a particular vendor is?
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to look to the future a bit now. We've mentioned a few kind of emerging technologies like AI, but I feel like on the whole, the sector has made a lot of leaps and bounds in terms of use of technology in a really effective way. How do you see over the next few years the sector's relationship with technology will evolve?
I think that's a really difficult question to give a informed answer on in the context of AI, because it seems to change from one week to the next, and I just don't know. And I think anything I speculate there is just going to sound ridiculous in 6 months' time. I guess what I see happening in the sector, though, is a slight shift in the structure of the way that technology is being used. So we had previously systems like Databox that I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, which are really that kind of initial foray into what we now call CRM and online ticketing. And then they were replaced by the new generation systems like Spektrix, or Audience View. And those systems often try to be lots of different tools and fix or meet the needs of lots of different use cases. So they were the website, they're the online sales channel, they're the box office software, they're the fundraising solution. They do absolutely everything. Now, I think we're seeing a move slightly away from that again. So I used the word ecosystem earlier on, and I think we're starting to see that become something that arts and cultural organizations adopt much more widely. So you might have a core product at the middle of your tech stack, and that could be your CMS, or it could be your ticketing system. And then you'll attach other systems to that, other best-in-class systems. So instead of going to your one provider and getting them to do everything, you select the different products that work for your organization. And I think another benefit of software as a service is that those integrations often already exist. They're pre-built. You can plug them in and turn them on easily. You don't have to manage them. You just have to connect them to each other. I think we'll see more of that. And I think we'll see more fragmentation in the kind of customer journey, effectively, of which bits of a customer journey, which bits of a transaction are looked after by which provider. That doesn't work for organizations of all size, because if you are a small to mid-sized organization and you're having to pay for lots of those different subscriptions, is that helpful? Probably not. Therefore, one of those kind of all-in-one box solutions is probably still the right way to go. But for some of those other large organizations, if they can go down that route, yeah, I think we're seeing evidence of that. And I would expect to see more of that over the coming years.
I guess one of the benefits of that is each of those kind of providers becomes a real expert in their little, in their part of the journey, in their little speciality. And that hopefully means that organizations are getting even more powerful solutions in each area.
Yeah, I think so. That's right.
And just looking forward again, what gives you most hope about the sector's future? We kind of, some of the challenges often come up very often, such as funding and skills development and talent retention. But what gives you most hope?
Look, we're still here, right? And you can go pretty much to any town or city in the UK and beyond across other parts of the world, and you can find fantastic stuff going on in the cultural organisations that are in that place. And I think regardless of the economic circumstances in which we operate, that will continue to be the case. I think the creative economy deserves to have the opportunity to thrive and to grow. And I do think that subsidy plays a big part of that. And I think it's critically important that it remains. Despite my arguments about running effective businesses, the objective that our sector is really for humanity, public good, if we're being really lofty about it. And that is not the same as retail. It's not the same as commerce in any other way. And therefore, does it need public support to develop and thrive and grow? Yes, absolutely. But even when that shrinks or is distressed, as is the case at the moment, you still see people doing really amazing stuff with the smallest limited resources that are available to them. And that gives you hope. Like what other sector does that in quite that way? And that's why I find myself ultimately doing it 20 years later. It's because you see that resourcefulness and you see the benefit it has to people's lives when they engage with that stuff. So yeah, there's plenty of hope.
I think as well with more and more people seem to be complaining about AI and the output of AI. I feel like the backlash to that is that more and more consumers will be pushed towards kind of human-made creativity that our sector kind of provides for people. So that's hopefully what I think we'll see more of.
I hope so. Yeah, let's come back in 3 years' time and see if we've been replaced by robots. But yes, I think you're probably right.
Yeah. Well, it's great to speak to you. We have to end there. Really appreciate your time. It's been a really useful conversation and a pleasure to untangle some of the intricacies of digital investment and funding in arts and culture. They're often not the easiest things to kind of unpick.
Very niche.
But something that you deal with a lot, obviously, for the sector. And for those who would like to seek Ben's expertise on some of these topics that we've spoken about today, you can find him at benpark.net. And to everyone else listening, if today's conversation has got you thinking about your own organization's approach to technology, funding, and how you develop your team, I'd encourage you to take one question from this episode and put it to someone you work with. Sometimes that's where the most interesting conversations start. So thank you for listening. Until next time, take care and goodbye.